watching Veracity Hill. Here is your host, Dr. J.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining me here for another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on the resurrection of Jesus. We are doing a part 2 of a chapter that we are working through in Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God, the Exaltation of a Jewish Preacher from Galilee. Last week, we looked at Bart's methodology for what we cannot know about the resurrection of Jesus. And in this episode, I will be looking at how he applies his methodology, looking at specifically 2 critical issues: the burial of Jesus and what he thinks is the invention of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, last week I laid out really where I found myself disagreeing with Bart on his methodology in a number of places. And we're going to begin to see how his methodology leads him to the positions that it does, but I am going to provide reasons for why his arguments for his proposal fall short. So we'll be getting into the weeds regarding his book. Before we do that, some announcements, also a tease for after I get through Bart's material, because we had a enthusiastic live chatter last week, and I want to tease for you a little bit about the questions I'll be answering of his from our time together last time. If you don't yet follow Veracity Hill on social media, find us on Facebook, Twitter /X. Does anybody call it just X? People still call it Twitter, right? I call it Twitter. It should be Twitter X. This is a marketing issue I have with Musk, because he's SpaceX. He could call everything X, for whatever reason. Network, it's the crossroads, I don't know, At any rate, we're also on YouTube, obviously. We have a TikTok channel that I know little to nothing about, but thank you to Gabe at Defenders Media, who helps upload the Veracity Hill videos to that. We are also on apologetics315.com. We have a video channel there you can subscribe to find some exclusive videos that are only there and nowhere else in the world, just at that website, apologetics315.com. So be sure to subscribe to us there. If you don't partner with us, please consider becoming a partner at Veracity Hill. Those are people that just chip in a few bucks each month. We'd love to have you join our ministry partnership team, supporting me, supporting the team at Defenders to continue producing this material. If you find yourself edified, you believe this is needed material, consider having us become a partner with you as well as you support Christian ministry work, especially the apologetics enterprise, as I call it. Okay, so book club. Where's the book? I've got to reach down, probably off frame. But Perspectives on Paul, the Veracity Hill Book Club. If you want to join, you can join virtually. If you're in the western suburbs of Chicago, consider joining us on the 2nd and 4th Tuesday of each month. Virtual, it's the same time. We do a Google Meet in the great room behind me. And so it's a great opportunity to get into the weeds on a book I wouldn't otherwise normally read. So book club also is a great time to, as my friend Howard says, talk shop. It's nice to talk shop with guys. Some of us, we have our jobs, we work our 9 to 5, we've got families, and so there's not as much time as our student days as that we can read and get into this material. And so Howard, who's getting up there in age, he enjoys talking shop, and I liked that analogy, since it's like a mechanics thing, right? Talking shop. All right, well, so that's book club. If you want to learn more about book club, go to my website, veracityhill.com. Let me reach and put this book down. It's book club's tonight, so I'll be doing some prep after our stream today for that conversation this evening. Okay, next, questions from a critic will come in the second half of the program. This was an active live chatter last time. Strigata, I think is how you would say it. Please correct me if that's mistaken, but Strigata is the way I would pronounce it. You can see here that this was just one screenshot of other questions and comments. I appreciate his interactions, but it was one of those things where it's like, if he throws 10 questions at me during the live stream and I have prepared material to work through, I'm not going to pause and work through those questions. So I told him, look, I'll take a screenshot and I'll deal with it in the next episode. So I am holding true to my word. We're going to deal with all 4 of his questions there that he has in that first comment. But we are first going to look at the rest of the chapter here on what Ehrman calls the resurrection of Jesus, what we cannot know. What we cannot know. And again, as I mentioned, he laid out his methodology. But then, to me, while I found myself strongly disagreeing in many cases with his methodology, I continued, you might suspect, to find myself with strong disagreements on how he applied that methodology and the reasons he gave for his proposal. And it was a change of mind for Barth, because, correct me if I'm wrong, he had believed at one point that Jesus was buried in a tomb. In this book, I remember it made waves online when he published it. He put out a different position, that he came to believe Jesus was buried in a mass grave, not a tomb. And he also argues that Joseph of Arimathea was a later invention by the early Christian community. So we will get into that. I need to switch over to my camera, but you can see that there's the book title. It's pixelated. There was no high-res image that I found, but I've held up the book a number of times. So let's get over to our visualizer. And I remember I have to zoom in, and we will see here. Yes. Okay. I will move this over, and we will get into portions of... So this is where I had stopped last week, right to where you can see he's kind of constructed each chapter this way, where he, for the first half or so, he'll talk about his methodology, his philosophical assumptions, historical methodology, criteria, this and that, and then he'll go in and apply it. Now, in this case, there's a little bit of application, but there's really a lot of theorizing that I think happens after his theory. And essentially, the first half was very much, well, it couldn't have been a miracle because it's impossible. Supernatural events don't occur. And so the historian can't know these things. The historian can't not know these things. It's just not up to history, the tools of history. I hold to a different view. But, okay, that's, if you want to listen to more of that, go back and listen to episode 264. This is episode 265, and we're going to get into it. He starts off a subsection of general considerations, and this is where he proposes that Joseph of Arimathea was a later invention. And it's because he just Barth finds it so implausible that someone who's on the Sanhedrin would come to request the body of Jesus to bury it. Because we know that the night before the Sanhedrin met and condemned Jesus. So, Barth, let's start with this subsection so you can follow along with me. Let's see, make sure I get this all framed right so you can view it as well. And maybe I'll zoom in a little bit more. Okay, hopefully that's good. There are numerous reasons for doubting the tradition of Jesus' burial by Joseph. For one thing, it is hard to make historical sense of this tradition just within the context of Mark's narrative. Joseph's identification as a respected member of the Sanhedrin should immediately raise questions. Mark himself said that at Jesus' trial, which took place the previous evening, the whole council of the Sanhedrin tried to find evidence against Jesus to put him to death. Now, I'll say here, it's not my common tactic to work through the entirety of a section. I just want to give us a little bit of context here as we start so we can see more of his remarks and the things I've highlighted and written in response to that. So you can see here, he's already casting doubt on this tradition. In other words, according to Mark, this unknown person, Joseph, was one of the people who had called for Jesus' death just the night before he was crucified. Why, after Jesus is dead, is he suddenly risking himself, as implied by the fact that he had to gather up his courage and seeking to do an act of mercy by arranging for a decent burial for Jesus' corpse? Mark gives us no clue. My hunch, as I'm already going off camera, it's at the bottom. My hunch is that the trial narrative and the burial narrative come from different sets of traditions inherited by Mark. So we already have quite a bit of theorizing. This is based on a hunch of Bart's. I think we actually have better evidence than a mere hunch. What we have are eyewitness testimonies, actually, because in multiple gospel narratives, we are told that Mary is at the tomb at the time of Jesus' burial. So we are told that one of Jesus' followers is there seeing these things happen. So we are also, in Luke's gospel, we are told, well, let me load up the PowerPoint. Since I've already got a response to this, before I get to the PowerPoint, let's review another type of argument Bart makes. One of the reasons why he dismisses this, among other reasons, is that the early Christian creed that he had previously talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, this early creed knows nothing about Joseph, and Paul betrays no knowledge of him. Okay, by that rationale, why don't we just say Mary Magdalene was a later invention of the early Christian community? Why would we think something like that? Why would we create this theory, this hunch of later traditions being fictionalized into the text? There's a fun wink term. Fictionalized, invented wholesale into the text. Now, I have my proposals as to why that might be the case, but we need to recognize that these are just theories, and there is a much simpler theory occurring. And the much simpler theory is that we actually have information from eyewitnesses. That is a far simpler approach as a historian when we look at the Gospels historically. So let's get to the PowerPoint here. Since I already have things I want to respond to, we'll be jumping back and forth. Let's see here if I do the presenter view. All right. Not that I have any notes this week for presenter view, but okay. This is the start of what I call historical leaps. Leaps by Bart. There you have it, page 152, which we just read a segment of. In other words, according to Mark, this unknown person, Joseph, was one of the people who had called for Jesus' death just the night before. Why is he suddenly risking himself? Well, Bart makes this deduction only by looking at Mark's gospel, and Mark's gospel alone. He just wants to understand it only in light of this. But it just so happens that we actually have 4 gospel accounts, and one of those gospel accounts actually answers Bart's question. Luke, the historian, Luke the physician, who is a first-rate historian, I will contend, writes this about Joseph of Arimathea, chapter 23, verse 50. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man, who had not consented to their decision and action. So we are told that Joseph didn't. His vote was no. Now look, if you follow politics at all, you will know that when a Senate or the House of Representatives passes something, that doesn't mean that every individual within that chamber agreed to it being passed. But yet, you still say the Senate passed this bill, or the House of Representatives passed this bill, or Congress passed that bill. It doesn't mean that what is true of the whole is true of each part of the whole. That's the fallacy of division. You may have heard me say this before in my corporate election debate, since theologically, I think the text of Scripture teaches corporate election, and we really ought not to commit the fallacy of division on the doctrine of election. And yet, here we have Bart committing that fallacy right away with Mark's account, and Mark's account alone. Imagine if we didn't have Luke to clarify the issue for us. If we only had Mark's account, Bart would still be committing what's called the fallacy of division, in thinking that what is true of the whole is true of each part of the whole. Why should we think that it was a unanimous vote to condemn Jesus? That is an inference, a deduction Bart is making without evidence. Lo and behold, Luke clarifies Joseph did not vote to put Jesus to death. So, right out of the gate here, we have a logically fallacious inference by Barth for this construction of a model that Joseph of Arimathea was a later invention. And we're going to see this domino effect about how it's going to continue to impact how he's evaluating the burial narratives. When you base this any model on an invalid inference, an invalid assumption, the model is going to get messy. It will get messy, and it's already going off the rails. It'll get off the rails even more so. All right. Let me see where my next one is. Let's look at page 154 first. Let me get back to the application is called Visualizer, but it's for this little webcam I've got. V4K. I don't know. It's nifty. I like it. I've enjoyed being able to show you what I'm talking about on camera during our live streams. Strigata is back. I see him in the live chat. He says, good evening. So you believe the resurrection happened for real? Strigata, hey, before I answer that question, you were probably just joining us. Maybe 10 minutes ago, I had mentioned I'm going to answer your 4 questions from last week. I took the screenshot. I want to work through Barth's material, but when I'm done working through this chapter, stay with me. I'm going to answer those 4 questions you posed to me last week. I've put them into my PowerPoint, so we will definitely be dealing with your questions. And I hope it doesn't upset you, but I do believe that the physical resurrection of Jesus happened for real in space-time. And because it happened in space-time, the historian can evaluate whether it likely happened or not. And Strigata, you say, cool, thank you very much. Am I saying that correctly? Strigata, is it a long I, stry? Help me out here with the pronunciation of your YouTube handle. That'd be great. Otherwise, I'll just keep calling you Strigata. All right. So let's get back page 154 before my own notes and PowerPoint back on 155. So you again see here this fallacy division on 154. This may, let me get background here. Barth talks about Luke writing speeches and acts. Historians, for lack of a better term, in this case, invented speeches. Now, this doesn't mean that the speeches were unfaithful to the content of what the person heard. They could have been faithful, but whether they were like, an audio, a voice memo type level of speech, probably not. Nevertheless, what you see here in Acts 13 is Paul talking about how they laid him in a tomb. It's a corporate group. Barth writes, this may appear to harmonize generally with what the Gospels say about Jesus' death and burial, in that he died and was buried. But here it is not a single member of the Sanhedrin who buries Jesus, but the council as a whole. This is a different tradition. There is no word of Joseph here any more than there is in Paul's letters. Does this pre-Lucan tradition represent an older tradition than what is found in Mark about Joseph of Arimathea? Is the oldest surviving burial tradition one that says Jesus was buried by the group of Jews? Well, so in my little notes, I write, and I'm not sure you can make out my little chicken scratch. So what? So what if there's this older tradition? Let's assume, for the sake of the game, let's assume that there is this older tradition that exists before the Gospels are written. Now, this older tradition is that there's this group that buried him that buried him. Okay, let's just differentiate buried versus buried in a tomb. That buried him. Well, what if there is this understanding in the very early Christian community that he was buried by the Sanhedrin? What if people started asking questions? Well, like who on the Sanhedrin was responsible for that? And all of a sudden, the Christians are beginning to get some answers from this local governing body. And it turns out that Joseph buried him. Well, why did Joseph bury him? Well, now they've got answers. And so the answers come into existence. The answers become known to the early Christian community. Does this mean, in my little scenario, that they've invented Joseph of Arimathea? No, it wouldn't lead someone to that conclusion at all. In fact, it would lead someone to the conclusion that the early Christian community came to reliable answers about what actually transpired. You see, Bart can have a hunch and create a model. I could also have a hunch with some textual evidence of what is claimed by the authors, by the evangelists, and we can see who their sources were. Now, I don't even think we have to assume this older tradition, earlier tradition kind of model. Again, I'm just assuming it for sake of the discussion here. We don't need to assume it because we have eyewitness testimony. We're told in multiple gospel narratives that there were women at the time of the burial. They were observing it literally happening. And that is far more likely to be the case than this proposal of an invention of a person inserted entirely, and he's the one responsible, and he went to Pilate, and there's this elaborate, this is not literary devices, folks. This is not simplifying for the sake of communicating faithfully what transpired. What Bart is proposing is this invention of a person, of events, in order to justify a theological belief, their motive. He's clear about that, and I'll talk about that. On 155, we get into this. Bart's trying to create a model that makes sense of these theological beliefs. All right, Strigata says, it doesn't upset me. Okay, it's a fish. Tasha Strigata. I don't know how that fish is pronounced. I'll have to look it up. But Casper, you say, is your name. So Casper, I'll try to remember that. Thank you for watching here again this week and for your comments and questions. Again, we will get to your questions. But let me run through a few pages here of Bart Ehrman's 4th chapter. Okay, page 155, and then I'll go back to the PowerPoint I have. So here is where you can see Bart begins to ascribe motive. And this is also logically fallacious. This is Logic 101. We should not appeal to motive. This is what Bart's trying to do. If the followers of Jesus knew he, quote unquote, had to be buried in a tomb, since otherwise there could be no story about the tomb being empty, and they had to invent a story that described this burial, then the only ones who could possibly do the deed were the Jewish authorities themselves. And so that is the oldest tradition we have, as in Acts 13:29. Possibly this is the tradition that lies behind 1 Corinthians 15:4 as well, and he was buried. Well, so Bart's trying to come up with, theorize what would bring the early Christians to invent Joseph of Arimathea. Well, and you can begin to see his thinking here. If the early Christian community believed Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, well, then you've got to have an empty tomb, because he knows Bart is fully familiar with all the different apologetic proposals and responses to that. So he's trying to figure out how it is, on his view, you have an empty tomb for the Christians. Well, they've got to create someone that buries Jesus and that the tomb was known. So they invent Joseph of Arimathea. And he says because the only ones who could possibly do the deed were the Jewish authorities themselves. Well, let's think about this one for a second as I head back to my slide. Second point here that I've got, you can see I quote there from page 155. Think about this, though. John chapter 19. We are told that there are women at the cross, at the crucifixion, and they're listed by name. And we're also told, and lo and behold, all three of them have the name Mary. And then you also have the beloved disciple that's there, who's a man. So you've got 3 women and a man witnessing the crucifixion according to John's gospel. Now you might say, well, this is all spiritual mumbo jumbo because it's John's gospel. Here's the thing. Look at the synoptics and you see that Mary and others are there. They're witnessing this stuff happen. They see the burial. They're following these events. They're buying the spices. The women were clearly very active here at the end of Jesus's life. So they are witnesses of these events. So Is Bart correct? Is he precisely right when he says the only ones who could possibly do this deed, this burial deed, were the Jewish authorities themselves? No, I don't think Bart is quite right there. I think he's overstating the case. We have other candidates that could have seen to it or even requested it of the Sanhedrin. So what you have as well on 155, let me go back to the visualizer. Let's see here. We're going to have a ChatGPT special later, as I say, when we tackle Bart's next issue I have with him. Just a little side point. In the story of Joseph of Arimathea, we may have an early instance of the named Jewish leaders. We may have an early instance of the phenomenon. What was originally a vague statement that the unnamed Jewish leaders buried Jesus becomes a story of one leader in particular who is named doing so. This word may. Yeah, we may have that, but we may not. We may not. I really think we don't. We don't have this story. Again, maybe we do, but that's not to say that this double tradition is unfounded. Again, I just gave you a model for how it could be grounded in history. The early Christians had this first tradition. It was the group, the Sanhedrin, that had him buried. But then they went and asked questions. Hey, which one of you guys buried him? Oh, it was Joseph. Okay, boom. Now you have this newer tradition because evidence came to light. The way this reads, the implied writing here by Bart is that it's historically invented. That is a non sequitur. You can play his game and still come away with the proper conclusion. I don't think we need to play his game because we've got eyewitness testimony. And so I think it's very clear. Mary tells the disciples, yeah, I saw Joseph of Arimathea. He was the one that put him in the tomb. Far simpler solution. Again, this model, it doesn't require, I'm recalling back to chapter 2, the Son of Man passages. What is so bad about just taking the Gospels at their word here? There's nothing supernatural here. There are no miracles. There are no claims of divinity even. What is so worrisome for, say, a naturalist to think that it was Joseph of Arimathea that had him buried in a tomb? And a lot of the criminals, they were crucified and they just left to hang there. You're right, but there are cases that exceptions were made and they were brought down, and that's why it's also noteworthy when those exceptions occurred. Hence why it's written about what happened to Jesus' body. So again, I just sort of wonder, what's the motivating factor here? Now, I'm not going to psychologize, but simply ask that as a matter of historical inquiry, why should we not take the Gospels at their word here? How is it that they're unreliable in this regard? That's a question I'd ask myself. Casper writes, I read in Ehrman it was common practice for Romans not to bury the people who got crucified and let them decompose. Yes, this is that very chapter, actually, Casper. As a sign and warning, it happened in the Middle Ages too, hanging corpses rotted away. In many cases, that was true, but there are exceptions. Some of those are written about, and we will also... Boy, I sounded Canadian there. They were written about. So, I also want to talk about how the Romans recognized Jewish sensitivities. That's a statement here I want to deal with because... Yes, good. Roman practices of crucifixion. There's another section, Greek and Roman practices of using common graves for criminals. But here's... Casper, when you talk about, hey, the Romans did this sort of thing, left people to bury, in many of the cases where we have evidence of this is not always about Jewish people that were crucified. And I say this because I hold to a stronger model of Roman-Jewish partnerships, we'll say, than Bart does. Well, what do I mean? On page 157, Barth claims the Romans who did crucify him had no concern to obey Jewish law and virtually no interest in Jewish sensitivities. Now, I highlighted this pink. In previous episodes, I talked about how I've got this little system, red, green, yellow. Sorry, folks, I only had a pink highlighter on me when I read this section. So, pink, but I wrote exclamations. Why did I do this? My understanding of antiquity, and again, Barth's obviously well-read in this matter. My understanding has been that in many cases, the Romans allowed the Jewish customs to occur, for them to respect their festivals, their Sabbaths. They did not require Jewish men to enlist in the military. They wanted to keep peace. This was a type of governing relationship where you wanted people to remain peaceful. This is why there was revolts were put down time and time again. It was a client state. So they wanted the money, the taxation, this and that. And this is why a lot of the Jewish people felt subjugated to the Romans, because the Romans had ruled over them. And yet Rome allowed them to live by their customs. There was a group of Jewish leaders called the Sanhedrin. I mean, it's not as if they had to always abide by Roman customs. But this is where I want to get into our Chat GPT special, all right? Because this statement by Barth, I simply took great objection against that Barth would claim something like this, all right? So I, on the other hand, think that the Romans very much had sensitivities to Jewish customs. And when I say it's ChatGPT time, as Casper says, in any case, Joseph of Arimathea is quite a mystical figure. Maybe mythical is what you perhaps mean, Casper. I disagree. I think he's a historical figure. But let's evaluate Barth's claim here about how the Romans had, quote, virtually no interest in Jewish sensitivities. So this is ChatGPT. And I asked it, I'll show you my prompt. Provide examples of how the Romans allowed the Jewish sensitivities. I was caught in my mind between Jewish festivals and Romans allowed Jewish sensitivities. So they gave some examples: military service, permission to observe the Sabbath and festivals, protection. You can see here. Then I thought, well, let's get some quotes. So the robot says, if you'd like, I can also provide a list of primary source quotations for each example. Yes, that is what I would like. Now, obviously, I'm going to qualify this that I have not yet looked into and dug into the primary source material. Take this with a grain of salt. Sometimes ChatGPT gets it wrong. Sometimes ChatGPT gets it right. So look into this yourself. But there are so many that I suspect the general principle will hold. Number 1, exemptions for Sabbath observance and court military appearance. Julius Caesar's decree found in Antiquities 14. No one shall compel them to come before the judges on the Sabbath day, nor on the day of preparation to it, after the 9th hour. If anyone be caught stealing their holy books or their sacred money, he shall be deemed a sacrilegious person. Here you also have the decree of the city of, oh boy, I'm not going to try saying it. Okay, I'll try. Halicarnassus. I think I got that right. Also in Antiquities. We have decreed that as many of the Jews as are willing may keep their Sabbaths and perform their holy offices according to their ancient custom, without impediment. Hold up. Barth says, the Romans who did crucify him had no concern to obey Jewish law and virtually no interest in Jewish sensitivities. But yet we have explicitly Roman decrees respecting Jewish customs and sensitivities. To me, we have seen where Barth has made some invalid inferences, and that's now led him to a certain proposal based on his hunch of what actually transpired, but we've got evidence to the contrary of this model of his. we really should dismiss his proposal at this point. We're just getting started with the Roman sensitivities of Jewish customs. Philo on Roman courts, for no magistrate ever compelled a Jew to appear in court on the Sabbath, nor required any action of him which violated the law. Permission to keep Jewish festivals. This one's important because there's a Jewish festival happening at the time of Jesus' death. Decree of Sardis, Josephus Antiquities. It has been decided that the Jews who lead a quiet life and are devoted to their own customs shall not be hindered from keeping their Sabbaths or from observing the other rites according to their law, like the burial rites. Come on, folks. Decree of Gaius Narbanus Flaccus. My ancient pronunciation of English Latin names, not so good. And I order that they shall not be hindered from assembling together for sacred meals and holy festivals in accordance with their ancestral customs. You've got a Roman respecting the customs of Jewish people. Number 3, protection of the temple tax, and cultic privileges. Julius Caesar's protection of the temple and tax, also found in Antiquities. I also ordain that the Jews shall be allowed to assemble together to have sacred meals, and that they may collect money for sending to Jerusalem, and that this money shall be delivered to the treasurers in Jerusalem. I'm looking at the live stream here. Let me zoom in. Oh, that sort of made it worse when I zoomed in. Oh no, I was zooming out. It happens to the best of us. There we go. All right, I've tried to maximize the text here. Casper writes, Paul doesn't mention him too, nor the empty grave. Paul does mention burial. Paul also doesn't mention Mary, so Mary Magdalene. So does that mean Mary was an entire invention? No. What Casper, I'd like you to think about this, and what I hope Bart recognizes, is that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Simply because something is not named does not mean it did not exist. And we'll get into that when we talk about one of your questions, Casper, about who was there at the discovery of the empty tomb. It's the same concept. I also talked about this last week when I gave this, we'll get into it when I answer your questions directly. So Casper, stick with us here. Protection of the let's see here. Did I already read this one? Yes. Next, Roman recognition of temple sanctity. A partition wall surrounded the sanctuary, and on it stood inscriptions forbidding any foreigner to enter under the pain of death. Even a Roman citizen was liable to the death penalty if he transgressed this law. Exceptions from participation in Roman civic religion. Augustus did not compel, this is in Philo, Augustus did not compel any Jew to transgress his national laws, nor to taste forbidden foods, nor to participate in the religious rites of others. Josephus, they shall not be forced to participate in festival days or sacrifices that are contrary to their customs. Tacitus, the Jews are devoted to their customs, and what is sacred with them is profane to us. They abstain from pork. They regard as impious anything that we regard as permissible. So, we can keep going on and on. There's 9 points. This is just point 5. I hope you've got the gist now. Cicero, the Jews have grown so numerous and they have obtained such privileges that they are protected in their assemblies and in the observances of their rights. Jewish legal autonomy. There was this sense of autonomy that the Romans gave to the Jews. A Roman governor declines jurisdiction, illustrating Roman custom. Dietary accommodations. You've got Seneca. Jewish burial rights. Here we go. Caesar wrote to the governors that no one should hinder the Jews from observing their customs regarding the burial of the dead. But Bart Ehrman says, the Romans who did crucify him had no concern to obey Jewish law and virtually no interest in Jewish sensitivities. Now, why does Bart say this? Because it's required for his model. That Jesus is this irrelevant figure and he's dead. And who would want to take him and bury him? It's because Bart has this theory that he was put into a mass grave, and so the Christians then invented this story that Jesus was buried in a tomb, and that it was Joseph of Arimathea who was on the Sanhedrin. But according to Bart, that doesn't make sense because Joseph voted to have him put to death the night before. So that doesn't make sense at all. So he's created this model But we have evidence directly to the contrary in conflict to Barth's model here. I hope I've come away with... Boy, there's still more to respond to, but I also know that Casper's waiting anxiously for us to get to his material here. Let me head back to my PowerPoint and see where we're at. Yes, let me quickly look at a few more points here. Maybe not worth mentioning. Maybe we'll just jump over to Casper's questions. All right. So yeah, okay. One more thing on 159. Let me show you with the camera. So now what Barth does do is he brings in some evidence of from Philo about mentioning an exceptional case of someone being brought down. But again, this is not Jewish custom either. This is someone else. So I think we need to look at the whole data set and to form a critical conclusion based on the whole data set. But I have double question marks here. Jesus' family did not have high connections. They did not have the means of burying anyone in Jerusalem. They weren't even from Jerusalem. None of them knew any of the ruling authorities to ask for the body. And what is more, in our earliest accounts, none of them, even his mother, was actually at the event. There are a lot of assumptions baked in here. So he says even his mother, well, John's gospel says that his mother was there. Barth's simply going to say, well, that's ahistorical, theologically invented, yada, yada. And I think Barth's just dismissing historical details of pericopes at this juncture. He will make claims that fly in the face of textual evidence and then say the evidence was invented. That's a lot of moving the goalposts. This idea that there was no one connected from his family to the authorities, that's also a leap, a historical leap. How does Barth know that there's no connection? There may have been a connection. We know that Jesus and his followers were staying in Bethany outside of Jerusalem, that they were connected. There was a little community. Why would we think that they weren't connected at all? And when there's evidence suggesting that they were connected, because Luke says Joseph was a good and righteous man. He was seeking the kingdom of God. Barth says it was invented. It's all made up. This is the problem I have, that there's this moving the goalposts where you provide evidence against this model based on a hunch, and then he's got to reinterpret other evidence that he hadn't dealt with and just say, oh, that's invented. I just don't think this is a strong argument for reading the Gospels in this way. Casper, you've written some more comments here, but what I want to do now, as I'll simply refrain from continuing further on in... There's only a couple more pages, I think. Yeah, let's see here. And I didn't have as much. Yeah. So my final comment here was, mass grave model flies in the face of historical method. Early sources, multiple sources. Okay. It flies in the face of historical method because of those two reasons, among others. But what we find is nothing to me that the historian should object to. What is so worrisome that there was this fellow named Joseph of Arimathea who buried Jesus? It requires nothing of us to, in terms of the impact on our worldview. You could be a naturalist, for example, and hold to this idea that Joseph buried him. Okay, Casper, you've been waiting. Thank you. Thanks for your comments, questions. You can see here, I've posted the screenshot from last time. And you had these 4 questions. Was the stone in place or not? Who was first? Where did the people go and tell? And did they tell? Where did Jesus appear? Okay? Now, the first 3, I'll give you credit. Number 4 is the hardest one. Okay? We're going to deal with all 4 of these within 10 minutes or so, maybe 15 minutes. So I deal with all these questions. So let's start. Number 1, was the stone in place or not? Between all 4 gospel accounts, canonical gospel accounts, it's unanimous. It was not in place when the women showed up. According to Matthew, I quote him here, Matthew 28, there was this earthquake, and that's how the stone moved. There was an angel who sat on top of the stone. Mark 16, the women asked, who will roll the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back, and it was very large. Luke 24, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. John 20, early, while it was still dark, and she saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she refers to Mary there. So the stone was rolled away in each of these cases. Now, I suspect, Casper, that between these 4 gospels, you might be thinking, gospel accounts I should say, you might be thinking Matthew's gospel is the one that might give a hint that Mary and the other women showed up before the stone was rolled away. The text doesn't require that of us, however. And I think that that's just reading Matthew's narrative too rigidly. So I see, the way I analyze all 4 gospel accounts, that in all 4 cases, the stone was rolled away before. It may have been in Matthew's gospel, it may have been at the moment or shortly before, sort of like a 30-second difference. You consider 30 seconds at the same time? Sometimes you do, at that moment. How long is a moment? But again, there's nothing in Matthew's texts which explicitly tells us they showed up and then it was rolled away. So, no problem there that I can see. Your second question, who was first? Well, I gave this example last week. In a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. In a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman, and Mike Licona was there too. Now, does that mean the first statement is incorrect? No, it doesn't mean the first statement is incorrect. Let's look at statement 3. In a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. By the way, this really happened. This actually happened just a couple weeks ago. I was in Boston. Bart and Mike had a debate on who wrote the Gospels. I was there. I had a conversation with him and with Mike. Proposition 3, in a church in Boston, Massachusetts, I had a conversation with Bart Ehrman. Tyson James was there and some others. This is also a true statement. It doesn't mean Mike Licona was not there, because Mike is not explicitly mentioned. All 3 of these propositions, all 3 of these sentences are factually true and not in conflict with one another. So let's consider how this is the case for who was at the tomb. As I click my laptop instead of my desktop. Boom. So who was first? There is unanimous agreement. Mary was there and there were others. Now the question is, who were the others? So let's look at these sentences. This is not mental gymnastics. This is not hermeneutical waterboarding, I think, as Mike says. My buddy Mike Licona. Matthew says it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, which could be the other Mary, that's logically compatible, and Salome. Now again, Matthew mentions Mary and the other Mary. That doesn't mean Salome was not there. Matthew's gospel simply mentions Mary and the other Mary and doesn't mention Salome. Let's go back. Proposition 2. I don't mention that Tyson James was there with proposition 2. Tyson James was there. He set up the debate and he was there. I shook his hand. He took a picture of me. It's now my Facebook profile cover image. So there you go. Salome is mentioned by name. Luke, Mary, Joanna, Mary, and others. John has Mary's the only one mentioned by name, but look at chapter 20, verse 2. We do not know where they have laid him. Mary says we. There's clearly other people here. Again, I don't see an issue here with this who was first. There's nothing logically contradictory. There's nothing in conflict here regarding who was first to arrive at the empty tomb. Next question. This one's slightly harder. And the fourth one is the hardest of all four, and a more serious challenge, I think, just in terms of the question at hand. But I'll talk about that. So number 3 question, I rephrased this because I think what you were meaning to ask was where or who did they tell? Matthew departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Mark, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Boom, end of story. That's it. There's a later part of Mark in later manuscripts, but many scholars believe the ending was lost. A number of scholars believe that that is simply the end. It ends in verse 8, for they were afraid. Luke, they went to the 11 and to all the rest. John ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple. Now, here's my conclusion. I do not see an explicit contradiction. Here's why. Okay, let's assume Mark's gospel is early, written first. We don't have the ending. We don't know what happened thereafter. How long were they quiet for? They said nothing to anyone. Well, for how long? A day? 2 hours? We simply are not told. The gospel narrative just ends right there. Then we see here, Matthew, they departed quickly, ran to tell his disciples, okay? So again, this saying nothing to anyone, this could mean they didn't tell the people around them. Instead, they went to the disciples, according to Matthew. Luke to the 11, Matthew and Luke, no problem, that's in harmony. And then you also have in John, Simon Peter and the other disciple, the leaders of the disciples. So you might say that by going to Peter, they're going to the disciples because he's the leader of the pack. He's the leader of the group. So again, I don't see anything explicitly contradictory here regarding where or who they told. When you said, Casper, if I said, come deliver this message to so-and-so, but don't tell anyone on your way. Okay, you're not going to tell anyone until you get to your destination. So again, there's nothing that would, and by the way, that description describes Mark's wording, this hypothetical. But I hope that demonstrates the logical compatibility of how these are consistent with each other. Let us talk about the most difficult and really what I think is a more challenging Bible difficulty. Where did Jesus appear? Now, I didn't get into the text. This requires a longer analysis, but I just gave the quick locations. You've got in Matthew, Mark, and John, Galilee, the post-mortem appearance in Galilee. Luke, it's in Jerusalem. And this is, again, one of the more difficult hurdles, we'll say. Now, my friend Mike Lacona will say that he believes Luke is compressing the narrative. Why is that? Well, he's not alone in this analysis. Eric Lyons penned an article at Apologetics Press back all the way in 2004. So this is 10 years before Mike writes his book on Plutarch. And so I want to just read for you Eric Lyons' analysis because it is detailed, it's succinct. He writes, according to Luke 24, verses 1, 13, 21, 29, and 33, the events recorded in the first 43 verses of the chapter all took place on the very day of Jesus' resurrection. The last 4 verses of Luke 24, however, took place more than 5 weeks later. What about verses 44 to 49? When were these statements made? The truth is, no one can know for sure. Luke gives no indication that this particular section took place on the first day of the week or on the third day, so this and that, right? So, one way of approaching Luke's post-mortem appearance narrative is that compression, Mike calls it compression, has occurred. Luke has shrunk this all down for the sake of brevity. So, is Luke taking some liberty here in this narrative in order to fit this all in? Mike would say yes. Now, I think it's even a little more complicated than that. And some of it may get down into the Greek as well. So let me load up for you interlinear. Let's see here. I've got to pull it up. You might see a gajillion tabs. You probably will unless Gabe crops it out for me. Okay, so here's Luke 24:13. This is the start of the Emmaus Road pericope. And I will zoom in here. Now, the ESV, I think, gets it wrong and causes a little bit of confusion, potentially. So let me read for you what the ESV says. Let's get it here. So I'm not going to put it up on camera. I'm just going to read it. You've got Luke 24, verse 13. This is how the ESV translates this. That very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus. Now, the way that's worded in English is it's a chronological reference. That very day, this happened. So, the day of the discovery of the empty tomb. I'm not positive it has to be read that way. And if you look in the Greek, you see here that, and behold, and then 2 of them on the day were going to a village being distant stadia 60 from Jerusalem, whose name is Emmaus. There's one way of reading this chronological reference differently. That is, that the 2 were traveling on the same day together. Not on the same day these events occurred. So there's another way of reading, I think, this chronological marker. And then 2 of them on the same day were going to the village. So what's of interest to the author here, to Luke, is that, well, it's interesting that 2 of the disciples were traveling north together on the same day. So again, this chronological marker might cause some confusion to people. Perhaps not, though. The general point here I want to make is that Luke does seem to be doing something differently. And whether we have a surefire answer for that, I don't think we do. But nevertheless, what we found with Luke is an author that is generally reliable. I think he's strongly historically reliable. That he seeks to provide an orderly account of what has transpired, and yet from time to time we can see him doing something with his editorial maneuvers and certain literary licenses, but yet we see him time and time again be faithful to recounting what transpired. So what that means is, with that stated and understood, what it means is that even if we have one difficulty left hanging for us that we haven't quite fully understood, that doesn't mean the entirety of Luke's gospel account should be thrown into the trash. Far from it. We still come to believe that Luke is generally reliable and he's a good historian. So, Casper, back to your 4 questions. Let me load it back up here. To your 4 questions, Casper. Was the stone in place or not? It was not. Who was first? Mary and a group of other women. Remember, they had bought spices. They had come to work on the body. They didn't know who would help them roll the stone away because it was very large. And they came to discover that the stone had been rolled away. Where did the people go and tell? Well, they went to the disciples afterward. Where did Jesus appear? Matthew, Mark, John say Galilee. Luke says Jerusalem. It's a little complicated. Relationship status, complicated. Does it mean it's a historical error? There's more going on with Luke's narrative than meets the eye. It's more complex, so it's not so simple as Luke. I mean, you can read it in a certain way. According to the narratives, Jesus spends some time with his disciples, but one way of reading Luke's narrative is as if this all happened in the same day on that Sunday. And you're like, wait a second. No, there was time that had transpired. So what exactly is happening here is the question. And that's something that scholars consider as they think about these things. Okay, let's see what you have in your comments, Casper, and I appreciate your engagement as well. Ehrman talks about historical evidence. Historians need more than just stories. They need to have real evidence to say a thing happened. Yes, I agree. I think Barth was a little inconsistent, though, regarding his proposal that Joseph of Arimathea was invented, because that is a claim about what happened in history, and that requires evidence. Now, my model says there were women observing the crucifixion. There were women observing the burial. These were eyewitnesses who recounted what they saw to the disciples. Now, I've got textual evidence. Barth's hunch has theories based on invalid inferences. So which model do we really want to support here? Again, I'm not asking you, Casper, or anybody else to affirm the resurrection of Jesus. I hope you do. But in this particular case regarding the burial narratives, why should we opt for Barth's proposal? I really don't think it's as strong as the alternative I'm proposing for. And again, I think it's based on some faulty thinking. Okay, so that does it for our show today. I am grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are people that just chip in a few bucks each month. If you've enjoyed this episode, whether you're watching on YouTube, following along the live stream here, or you're listening on podcast form, whatever app you use, if you've found this program edifying, you think more of this needs to happen, you want to support this type of Christian ministry work, please consider partnering with us at $20 or $50 or even $100 a month. We have a spectrum of givers supporting this program, and we would love to have you join. We certainly need it, especially as the year is coming to an end. Please consider making a one-time gift to support this ministry effort. I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. They are Apologetics 315, Defenders Media, and Rethinking Hell. I want to also thank the crew at Defenders Media. Each week, I call them out by name: Gabe, Mark, Dante, Sophia, Beth, Kyle, Kevin, and Chris. We've got some freelancers there. Thank you for all the fine work that they do. Really couldn't do this work without them. It would be, production value would plummet for sure. And there wouldn't be as many clips. And so if you like getting those clips, the shorts on YouTube and other platforms, it's because of them. So thank you, my co-laborers. Last but certainly not least, I want to thank you for watching and for listening in as we're striving for truth on the resurrection of Jesus.
This has been Veracity Hill, a viewer and listener supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.